Right, guys. In this video, I wanted to talk about how to pace progression depending on your block length. And because block length is going to really determine how much time do we really have to build up to our anchor percentage. And the anchor percentage is going to be really that second to last week of training where we are going to be taking a certain amount of weight that is going to set ourselves up for the ability to PR on our last week of the block. That's the goal of powerlifting training, is to PR our blocks and without really overly fatiguing us. And so a good way to conceptualize this is like, what's the lightest weight I can use to feel prepared for that last week of training without spilling over into fatigue. That's going to really make my estimated 1 rep max go down or maintain that next week, because we ideally across the training block, we want to see our estimated max go up slightly on a week-to-week basis, with our last week of the training block being our peak estimated 1 rep max. If you find that you're peaking early, which basically means your estimated 1 rep max was highest in like a prior week of the block that was not the last week, then you did not pace your progression properly. So really, the main difference between each block length is going to be how much time that you spend within this 80 to 90% of the goal weight of the last week of the training block. This is really, all these percentages are based off of the goal weight of the last week. So in my training paradigm, and how I conceptualize things is that we've built our strength in this 80 to 90% of our week 4 or week 5, week 3 goal, whatever it is, last week of the training block. And that's really where we need to sort of chill. I made a video, I'll link down in the description below, about block length, but really the block length depends on how much time do you really spend building that, because some people need more time to build strength so they can express strength and drop down fatigue. Some people also just need more time to also just adapt to the training stimulus, and they can't peak very fast. So this is sort of how I conceptualize things. So if you look right here, in a 3-week block, usually every block is going to start out around 80 to 83%. Then we're going to jump to the anchor point, which for most people I find is about 90 to 93% of the goal weight. There are some people, bench press in particular, that might need to touch heavier, like 95%. But in general, like, I find this is what works out the best for most people is this range. For week block, just a little bit more time in the middle of that, and then going into week 3. And then week 5. You also notice that the jumps are just smaller. On a 3-week block, you can really see it's about, roughly a 10% jump. Week to week, a 4-week block is about a 5%, and then a 3-week block is about a 3% jump when you're building. So, and the reason why, depending on how fast you adapt, that's why it's bigger or smaller jumps, right? So that's sort of how I would pace things depending on block length. I want to give an example of this with some of my clients. So this is my client Hanson. So Hanson does a 3-week block. So you can look at his stuff right here on his squat, for example, and this is the block he's currently on, but the last one went really, really, really well. This is actually the first time that we tried this out. But if you look at his week 4, he went for the high end of the range. That's what all these percentages are based off of. If you look at that here, you do 445 on the week 1. So you did 375 divided by 445, roughly about 84%. So you start off pretty light, and then on the second last week, being 400 to 410, that's roughly about, he took 405 divided by 445, took about 91%. So you can kind of see there, like, that worked out really, really, really well for him, and he was able to really PR this block and hit the easiest squat he's ever done. My client Ryan, he has a lower anchor percentage point, like he's on the lower end of about 90%. But if you look at how we pace his progression here, for example, on bench press, 240, this is a 3-week block, so I'm going to show a different one. If you look at where he started off at 250, and he ended off at 297. So where you start off, 250 divided by 297, around 84%. And then week 2, a smaller jump too, about 3%, and then another 2 to 3% bump up in that next week, and then he was able to PR with a bigger jump into his week 4, 265 divided by 297. around 89%, so a little bit lower. And again, like these are just general guidelines with like what I give. You could be a little bit lower or above it depending on like the person, but it's just a general like range that you can work with and conceptualize. It's not really going to make a big difference. What matters is basically just how quickly you move it through that 80% range to the your anchor point with 90 to 93%. And then with someone like Fly Hunter, we figured out with him that he needed just smaller jumps on a week-to-week basis, or for him to feel strong. He's a little bit different with how he paces his progression. We'll keep things a little bit heavier, and he has a little bit of a smaller anchor percentage point. So if you look at this, for example, in this block that he's currently going through, 75 divided by 305 for his top end, like 90%. But if you look at like his, again, that very similar jump, I guess, as far as again the anchor point. But like his overall weekly jumps are pretty small going up to that point. You can see like in his accumulation phase, he's just chilling that smaller range, and you can see with 240 divided by 305, it's even a little bit less than where we start off on. Or sorry, so 250 divided by 305. It's right within that range. So you guys can kind of just see like how it's paced and how you can make those jumps. But this is something that I think is really important on your primary days to really do in your powerlifting programming, is make sure that you are pacing things properly depending on your block length within how much time you usually spend in that 80 to 90% range. And as far as these ranges, my recommendation would be like where should you be? Like where do you usually decide where a lifter should be in my coaching program? So generally, the stronger the lifter is, they're going to need to have probably lighter weights when they're building, and will benefit from just keeping things a little bit lighter. They can push and they can make a bigger jump into their last week of training just fine. So if you are stronger, I would say, if you're within that 450 plus dots range, for example, which is where I would consider like you're pretty strong, I would go more towards the low end of the range. If you're 400-ish dots, probably more towards like the higher end of the range, 350 to like 400. That's about like what I would recommend is going a little higher, just because like you're going to need to touch heavier weights in order to feel stronger in general. Than someone who is generally going to be a little bit stronger, because you get less fatigue, and you tend to need to have more stimulus from your load, from like the load on the bar, as far as percentage of 1 max, because your just absolute loads just aren't as high. That's what I would recommend doing. I'll include this in the notes in the description. Hopefully, you guys, this makes sense. If you guys have any questions about what I said, just let me know. But talk to you guys in the next one. If you guys are interested in coaching, want me to take care of all the nitty-gritty details like this for you, links are down below to apply for coaching. So, peace.